In this introductory video about the nervous system, we are going to be introducing the terms of the different neurons that we have, the basic anatomy of the neurons, and how is it that neurons transfer those important messages to control the rest of our body. We're going to be discussing what is the resting potential of a neuron and the action potential of these neurons. The nervous system, it's electric. Believe it or not, the nervous system, it's electric. It depends on electricity, and that electricity is created by the movement of ions from one place to the other, creating a beautiful electrical current. The cells of the nervous system, these very special cells of the nervous system, they're called neurons. And the basic function of the nervous system, which is composed of these neurons, it's control of every other part of our body through messages. And just like we mentioned before, the messages are transported by electricity. Let's talk about the anatomy of the neuron, the different structures that we can find in a neuron that are going to determine the function of these very, very important cells. Let's get our laser pointing here working. Let's first begin with the most obvious structure that we have in there, and that is the nucleus. This is the central nervous system of the neuron itself. It controls the function of each and any other individual neuron. So there in the center, we have the nucleus. Following the nucleus, we have the soma of the cell, and this is just the name for the body of the cell, this area that we have in there. And even though it's not shown in our picture, but we understand that it is in the soma that we have the mitochondria, the endoplasmic reticulum, we have the vesicles, the lysosomes, and all of those other cellular structures to keep the cells alive. So from the body of the cell, right, from the soma of the cell, we have projections. And those projections are going to be later on very, very important for understanding the transmission of messages through the neuron. Those projections coming out from the soma, just like this ones that we're pointing out and here, are called the dendrites. And the dendrites are the structures that are going to be in charge of receiving a signal from there and transporting it through the soma to the rest of the neuron. This area that we have there, which is not identified in this picture, is called the axon hillock. And this is the trigger zone. This is where that initial message is going to be forming, right? It's going to be forming, and we're going to talk more about that as we progress on this video. This is the trigger zone for that message or that action potential to move through the body of this other structure that we have there. This long process coming from the soma. The longest process coming from the soma, it's called the axon. It's called the axon, another very, very important structure here of our cell. At the distal ends of this axon, we have the axon terminals, and this is going to be where the message is going to be sent through adjacent neurons in the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. Now, if we notice, we have some orange or yellow structures here surrounding my axon. These are called the myelin sheets, and we're going to talk a little bit more about these myelin sheets in the coming slides. The myelin sheets are produced by a special type of cell, an associated cell of the neuron called the Schwann cells, and they produce this isolation. They produce this covering structure along the body of the axon or the length of the axon. The spaces in between those myelin sheets are called the nodes of Ranvier. So now that we have all these structures here discussed from the neuron, it's very important to remember, most of all, what the dendrite is, what the axon is, and of course the axon terminals. Those are going to be the key players for understanding the function of a neuron. Now here, let's talk a little bit briefly about what these myelin sheets are. We have two examples here of two neurons receiving a message, and let's see how those messages compare with each other. Here to the left, we have a neuron that is trying to send a message down that axon. And as we can see here from this animation, that electricity stops along the way, the electricity dissipates and the message cannot reach the axon terminal and the end. But in comparison to that, here to the axon, in the axon to the right, we can see how the message moves very, very fast from the dendrites all the way down into the axons. And precisely this is the work, this is the function of those myelin sheets. They provide an isolation, they provide protection, keeping the internal environment that is necessary for the signal translation, keeping it there, keeping it in the right conditions. So the message could be transported faster and more efficiently all the way down from the dendrites to the axon terminals at the end. So those myelin sheets are very important for message signaling because they are going to aid the process. Otherwise, the message could stop and it will never reach the axon terminals, leading to very serious conditions regarding the nervous system. Now let's see the basic physiology of the neuron. Even though we mentioned it already, the basic physiology or function of the neuron, it's transporting a message from the dendrites all the way down to the distal end of the axon. And like we are seeing here in this little animation, signals are going to come. They're going to be received by the dendrites. They're going to be accumulated through the membrane of the neuron. They're going to reach that trigger zone or the axon hillock, and there is going to be fired along. It's going to be fired along the length of the axon, and then it's going to be transmitted to the axon terminals where they're going to signal other cells, other structures. It all depends on where this neuron is. In this other animation, it gives us a sense on how is that this electric message flowing through a network of neurons look like. So we can see it starts from the dendrites and then it fires up down a signal that keeps getting transmitted from neuron to different parts of our body. All right, so now that we understand the basic physiology of the neuron, which is transporting a message from the dendrites all the way down to the axon terminals, I think it is time to talk about the direction, right? Where is the signals going to, or where are the signals coming from? And from that, we have to talk about the two different parts of the nervous system, which are the central nervous system, sometimes referred to as CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, sometimes referred to as the PNS. And we're going to have signals that are coming from the peripheral nervous system, from sensory receptors, from receptors in other places of our body, and that signal is going to go from the receptors to the central nervous system, and other messages are going to come from the central nervous system all the way down to effector structures, like for example our muscles. So let's talk about the different names of the neurons depending on the direction where this signal is being transferred. First of all, a neuron that is connecting with another neuron. Let me get really quick here, a laser pointer to make this a little bit easier. Neurons that are connecting to another neurons, or neurons in between neurons, are called interneurons. And they just, as I said before, they connect one neuron to the other. So when a message is produced in the central nervous system, and here we have a cross section of a spinal cord, which is part of the central nervous system, when that message originates in the brain and it travels down the spinal cord, and the message goes from the central nervous system to an effector, in this case a muscle, we call those efferent neurons, meaning that the signal is coming from the central nervous system all the way down to the peripheral nervous system, or effector structures like the muscles. And the neurons that do this are called efferent neurons. Now, from efferent neurons, we have two different types of efferent neurons. So neurons that we can control voluntarily, and the neurons that we cannot control, which are called the autonomic, meaning the word auto, meaning from not control. And examples of autonomic neurons are the neurons that are connected to our smooth muscle, and of course our glands. Our brain autonomically take care of these actions. Now, the ones that are voluntary, and we know that those are called our motor neurons. Those are the neurons that are connected to our skeletal muscle and can produce voluntary movement whenever we feel like, or we take the decision of making a movement. So the signal is going to move through the efferent pathway from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system and effector structures. Now, what happens if the signal is going the other way? It's coming from a sensor. It's coming from a receptor somewhere in our body. For example, our skin, our eyes. These neurons that transfer signals from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system are called afferent neurons, and the pathway, it's called the afferent pathway. So it moves from the peripheral nervous system into the central nervous system. So it is important to know the distinction of these words, afferent and efferent, because it gives us a sense of the physiology of whatever process we are discussing. If we're talking about the movement of muscles, we're talking about efferent neurons, and the message comes from the CNS to the PNS. But if we are talking about sensations, about stimulus or stimuli that are being received, we are talking about the afferent pathway, meaning that it moves from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. Now let's talk a little bit about the cells of the nervous system, because we can think, when we talk about the neurons, that every single organ of the nervous system, it's composed of the same neurons, and that is not correct. Let's first talk about the cells of the central nervous system. Let's begin with the astrocytes. The astrocytes are the most abundant neuron in the central nervous system, and their function is to support and to anchor, to keep things in place around the central nervous system. Also, a very important job that the astrocytes have, it's recycling neurotransmitters. And we're going to discuss later on this neurotransmitter, this chemical message in the nervous system. Here we have a picture of an astrocyte. It's called an astrocyte because it resembles a star. It has many processes, and as we can see, those processes attach to other structures. In this case, blood vessels that are going to supply the necessary nutrition, not only for the astrocyte, but also for the neurons themselves. And this helps to construct or to keep that important structure of the major organs of the central nervous system. Besides the astrocytes, we have microglial cells. And these microglial cells are a little bit of an army that we have to protect the central nervous system against invading pathogens. If we come in contact with bacteria or virus or any type of foreign matter, these microglial cells have the ability to differentiate into macrophages, and literally the macrophages would eat or destroy or ingest all this foreign material to protect the integrity of the structures of the central nervous system. Other cells that we have here, it's the oligodendrocytes. And this type of cell have a specific function of isolation and protection of the nerves, just like we talked about before when we discussed the myelin sheaths. That protection, that isolation, it's necessary so that signal can travel all the way through down the axon. These are the cells that form the myelin sheaths of the central nervous system. So as we can see here, the brain, the spinal cords, and the nerves are not made of only just one type of neuron. This is a combination of different cells that are working together, not only to transfer signals from one place to the other, but also to help keep it in place, keep the necessary nutrition so that cells could be maintained alive, and also ensure that the messages are transferred efficiently from one place to the other through the afferent or efferent pathway. Now let's discuss the cells of the peripheral nervous system. Kind of similar in function, but they have different names because they are in different locations. So let's start talking about satellite cells. These are cells that are very similar in function to the astrocytes. But the difference from these cells is that they can serve as precursors to skeletal muscle cells. In case that we need to construct new muscles, we have specialized cells of the peripheral nervous system that can undergo differentiation to produce those brand new cells. So they offer protection, they offer anchorage to those cells of the peripheral nervous system, but they can also be used for constructing brand new muscle cells. On the other hand, we have the Schwann cells that we mentioned before, and these are the cells that are going to produce the myelin sheets that are on the peripheral nervous system, and we already know that those myelin sheets are in charge of protecting, isolating, and making sure that the signals are transported efficiently from the dendrites down to the axon terminals. To talk about some types of neuron, we have 4 different types of neurons, which can be summarized into 3 different types of neurons, and this is based on their shape. Let's start with the cells that are, or the neurons that are under the classification of unipolar. The term uni comes from the word one, and it's referring to the amount of processes or projections that are coming out the soma of the neuron. So uni comes from the word one, and as we can see here, only one projection is coming out of this cell. So that is why we call them unipolar. Under the same category of only having one process, we have the pseudo-unipolar, which they only have one process, but it's called pseudo. Pseudo comes from the word not real because it resembles having 2 different processes. But those 2 processes are just a ramification of one process that is coming out of the soma of the cell. So these are a very special type of cell, very rare also too kind of cell, and basically their job is that they connect the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system. So it doesn't matter if it looks like it has 2, we should pay attention to the amount of projections coming from the soma of that neuron. Now let's move to the bipolar, and bipolar comes from the word 2, and as we can see here, we have 2 processes coming out of the central soma. 2 processes coming out of there. It's going to have one axon. One of them is going to be considered an axon, and the other one is going to be considered the dendrite, or the receiver of information. That's why in here it's described as a sensory receptor, and this type of cell is very, very rare to find them in our body. They're normally associated with the sensory functions of the nervous system. Then finally we have the most familiar type of neuron, which is called the multipolar neuron, because it has 3 or more projections coming out of that central body of the cell, or that soma. It's going to have multiple dendrites, just like we are seeing here in our illustration, and it's going to have one long axon finishing with the axon terminal, and it is to be expected that the multipolar neurons are the most abundant neuron in the nervous system. Very well. So to summarize, in this video we discussed many important aspects of the basic physiology of what the nervous system is. We described the basic anatomy of the neuron, including those important structures like the dendrite, or the receiver of the information, the axon, which is the path for this signal to travel from one place to the other, and of course the axon terminal, which is going to be the sending edge, or the sending side of the neuron. We discussed the different pathways, or the different directions in which the messages move, when we discussed the afferent and efferent pathways of the transfer of information. And of course we discussed some of the different types of cells that we can find in the central nervous system, including the astrocytes, the microglial cells, the oligodendrocytes, and some of those important cells from the peripheral nervous system as well. And those types or characteristics or shapes of neuron, which were the unipolar, pseudopolar, basically under the same category, the bipolar neuron, and the most abundant neuron in the nervous system, which is the multipolar neuron. Very important, guys, to remember the nervous system is electric. It is through electricity that the central nervous system controls the rest of our body. In the next couple of videos, we're going to be discussing how is this energy created? How is that this energy can trigger actually a message going from one place to the other. And those topics are going to include the resting potential of the neuron. How is it that a graded potential eventually forms or triggers an action potential, and how is it that this action potential triggers the chemical response that sends a message from one neuron to another? Thank you all for your attention.